Today I am super excited to talk to you guys about tiny data visualizations. And I'll get into that more in a second. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Matt. I work for a company called Planetary. We're a design and development agency. I'm a designer and a developer. That's our website, follow me on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. So, tiny data visualizations. We've seen a lot of things today, and I wasn't around yesterday, but I'm sure we saw a lot of visualizations that dealt with reporting, and the previous presentation is a great setup for this because it's really it's becoming more and more of a part of reporting every year, and we're sort of starting as designers and developers to be involved in the reporting process, which is super exciting. But this is more or less how a lot of people see data and reporting is like, we're going to report the story, we're going to go out and find some data to back us up, and then we're going to hire a designer to mock that up in a graph, and it's going to be really great. People are going to believe us because we have graphs. But there are some great examples out there of people digging into data and using it to do really good reporting. This is from the New York Times. This is about the Olympics. They did a lot of really great visualization on the Olympics. This is a thing that I've been seeing a lot lately. Maps like these are all over the place. And just stories that really use that graphical representation of data to drive home ideas and stories. But these are all sort of examples of how we get to use a lot of different methods and a lot of rich representations of data, and we get to really use the screen as this big canvas to do some complex things and convey some complex ideas. But more or less, a lot of the times the visualization is the illustration of the data, right? You have a story, which happens in the text, and then you have graphs alongside or in between the text to sort of illustrate points that are being made. And what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and a lot of other people have been thinking about, is how do we integrate the data more tightly into the text and more tightly into the story, as opposed to standing outside of it and being a part of it. So a really great series of thoughts on this came from Edward Tufte, who you might know, who sort of coined this term Sparkline and started thinking about small graphics, very small data visualizations. And he defined this term Sparkline to be a small, intense, simple word-sized graphic with typographic resolution. And that's packing a lot of things into a small sentence, but small, intense, simple. These things are not necessarily going together very well all the time. So I'll start by way of example of what a small, intense, simple, word-sized graphic is that we might be familiar with. This is a small, intense, simple, word-sized graphic. And it's really useful in conveying a lot of information in a very short space. It's kind of a small piece of data visualization for your emotions. And it's super powerful when integrated with text, because you can take something really simple like this, change the graphic representation, and change the meaning entirely. So these very small, very intense, very word-sized graphics are really powerful, and this is a really good illustration that we're very familiar with. But when it comes to how we typically think of data visualizations, there's not a whole lot of examples out there. So I'll sort of give you an example that's a little bit more traditional, and taking something like this, just financial tables, and thinking about how we can make them better with these Sparklines, small typographic resolution graphics. Well, it's super simple. We can just take a trend line and we can sort of add it to the table like we would add another column. We don't need to export this to an Excel, graph, or open up, a whole different sort of context to it. We can include it like we would include another column of data. And in fact, in a lot of different applications, that column of visualization can do the same work that all of the other columns of data did. So we can actually make our table much smaller and much more complex, depending on the story we're telling with the data. We can actually replace a lot of sort of numbers with sparklines. There's some great examples of sparklines that are and small visualizations that are starting to show up in reporting. There's this great Wall Street Journal story right now that visualizes all the states in the US and how they voted historically as these very, very small little graphs. Twitter has a great analytics sort of platform that uses sparklines. This is from mine. Maybe get that up a little bit more. This is actually an example from a platform that we built at Planetary that sort of shows a lot of data in a very small amount of space, high, low, average, and the current data value there. And you can kind of combine a lot of sparklines and it's not all about simplicity in that specific context. Sometimes it allows you to increase the density and pack more information into a small space. And sometimes, with data visualization, that's our goal, is not just to simply replace the visualization, not replace the sort of story with a data visualization, but add to it, and to add that density. So how should we design small graphics? Because this is a question that I really struggle with a lot, because the same rules don't apply to the small world that they do to the large world. And even obviously people struggle with best practices of large graphs, as we saw previously. So in the small sort of quantum data visualization world, we have even fewer rules. This is just an example of what happens when you take a regular sized graph and you make it small. It becomes pretty much illegible. So here's 3 rules. So these are 3 great rules for data visualization in general, but they're especially true for tiny data visualization. Number 1, use as little ink as possible, and when I talk about ink, I mean that literally and metaphorically. Don't include stuff if you can. Just keep it simple and try to represent the data with as little as possible. Scales and labels are super important. Saw that before. And lastly, don't rely on color if you can. For accessibility reasons, largely, color blindness is a thing that data visualization sometimes runs up against, but also it's just one less thing to worry about. And as a designer, I tend to take those opportunities as much as possible. So we'll look at some of this in sort of an example of a story that you typically see some of these large graphs sort of accompanying. This is just a very typical financial story that actually spends a lot of words trying to describe data in sentence format. So we talk about stocks losing 7% of their value. We talk about being declining 15%. That last sentence just kind of hangs it out there that European stocks fell, but doesn't actually qualify it at all. So we can actually add some context to this and some graphics that provide that data without needing a large sort of table to go next to it. And we can provide just enough context to increase sort of the value of that reporting. Even better, if we want it, if it sort of gets lost there in the sentence, you can annotate the text with small graphs instead of needing large or even interactive components. So then, what tools can we use to execute these visualizations? The first one that I've used a lot is D3, which a lot of you are familiar with. But even if you're not familiar with D3 and are interested in it, starting with these small graphs and starting with these very simple things is a great way to learn it, because you're not dealing with a lot of components. So this is some of the simplest D3 sort of code you can write. It's just, let's draw a line and let's insert it into a paragraph, and let's just keep it as simple as possible. So if you're interested in this, I highly encourage you to experiment with D3 to execute these things. But D3 is definitely not the only tool we can use. And one of my favorites in preparing this presentation is this font called FF Chartwell. People typically don't think of fonts as software, but fonts are software. And they're capable of doing some really interesting things using ligatures. And ligatures are typically, in typefaces, how you combine two letters together to sort of make them more readable. Chartwell actually uses that feature to let you combine numbers, like you see on the left. So if you typed out that sentence, 59 plus 35, etc., in any other typeface, and then went to the drop down and picked FF Chartwell, it would turn into that chart on the right. So without needing to really get into a lot of complex decision making, you can produce some really interesting things. And because it comes from text, if I were to do the same on the web and apply that as a web font, then it's actually converting the text. So you have this great parity. You don't even need to go through JavaScript. You don't even need to go through another layer of transformation. If I was to copy and paste that graph, I would actually see the data underlying it when I pasted it out. So it's a really cool method for accomplishing very typographic scale things. But one of my favorites, and especially recently, is the fact that Unicode actually has these little shapes that you can use it's not even a different typeface. It's just the text itself. You can actually include as characters. And there's some great tools for this. There's a great command line utility called Spark that I use to do some of this. These are things that you could paste in a tweet. And I actually was just working on this last night. I didn't have time to sort it out, but I was thinking of all the applications of Twitter bots that could do visualizations without needing to actually generate graphics. So there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different methods that you can use to generate these tiny graphs using those same design principles that I was talking about earlier. So that is my very brief presentation to hopefully get us into lunch quickly, but I'm happy to take questions.